Democrats have introduced an inadequate and frankly embarrassing minimum wage bill. Now, in this video, I'm going to break down what is in this bill, what has been passed already, what Joe Biden has done, and also where the minimum wage would be if it were tied to productivity. But before I get to all that, let me first start with what Joe Biden has done. So this is an executive order that he pushed a few days ago, signing an executive order to pass a $15 minimum wage for federal workers. Now, this is to start the work, as it says here, to start the work that would allow him to issue the increase within the first 100 days. So again, this is for federal workers and also federal contractors to be paid at least $15 an hour. This is what's in his control. So Biden can't pass a $15 an hour bill himself. But what he can do through executive order is increase wages for federal workers. Now, that's where we get to today. As NBC News writes here, just in, House and Senate Democrats introduced legislation to raise the federal minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 by 2025. Now, there are a couple things here. Let me start with how Democrats already are coming to the table with the compromise. I wrote this on Twitter. This is essentially my notes here on this piece, so I'll just read this out. But I say here, putting aside how inadequate this is, if Democrats actually wanted to pass this, they wouldn't come to the table with the compromise. They'd come with $15 an hour by the summer and have Republicans water it down to $15 an hour by 2025. Really, Democrats should be coming to the table with $20 an hour. So this is just how you negotiate. You don't come to the table with a watered down bill. Now, part of the issue here is that this is the exact same bill that was passed in 2019 through the democratically controlled House. The Senate, of course, did not take it up, the GOP-controlled Senate, but they are simply reintroducing the same bill that was passed in the House 2 years ago to try and get it through with the now democratically controlled Senate, with Kamala Harris being the tie-breaking vote. Now, the other issue, of course, is that they need 60 votes unless they pass it through budget reconciliation, which is something they will try and do. If they don't get those 60 votes, this gets back to the issue. Of course, Democrats are not going to get 60 votes for this bill. So why don't you come to the table with something larger and maybe force, at that point, have a discussion, negotiate down to whatever your position is. But to come to the table with this very conservative compromise already is just not how you negotiate. This is not how you actually pass serious or real help for people. You have to start with something much larger than you even want. So then if you're forced to negotiate it down, to compromise down, then you're compromising to a place that is closer to your actual position. But once again, they come to the table with the compromise. Now, this isn't the only issue with this bill. As if you look through it here, after the first 4 years, so once it raises to $15 an hour, it is then tied to the median hourly wage increase. So instead of tying it to inflation or tying it to productivity, which I would prefer, I'm going to show you later how much you would be making right now if it were tied to productivity, they're tying it to median hourly wage. So now why is this an issue? Well, looking at EPI.org here, again, I'll link to all this below the video. You can read through all this data yourself. They write here, the 95th percentile continues to pull away from middle and low wage workers. Cumulative change in real hourly wages of workers by a wage percentile, 1979 to 2019. So if you look at this graph, the top increase here is from the 95th percentile. This right here is the median. So now at 15.1%. This is the median wage increase, the 50th percentile. Now, explaining this further, to put this growth and inequality in perspective, consider that the 10th percentile wage grew from $9.75 to $10.07 an hour. Over this 40-year period, wages for this group increased only 32 cents in real inflation-adjusted terms. The median wage grew from $16.79 to $19.33, an increase of only $2.54. At the top, the 95th percentile wage grew from $41.15 to $67.14, an increase of $25.99 an hour. So this is the major difference here. You have by tying the increase after 4 years to the median wage, over the last 40 years, you've only seen an increase here of $2.54 in the median wage. Now, tying it to productivity, as I'm going to show you, would make a hell of a lot more sense. So the gap between productivity and a typical worker's compensation has increased dramatically since 1979. This is productivity growth and hourly compensation growth 1948 to 2018. So look at the consistent growth in productivity. Meanwhile, since about late 1970s, 1980, the hourly compensation has stagnated. So if you tied hourly compensation to productivity, it would make a lot more sense. I'll get to the number that it would be in a minute here. But first, Counterpunch writes, the distinction between inflation and productivity is an important one. If the minimum wage rises in step with inflation, we are effectively ensuring that it will allow minimum wage earners to buy the same amount of goods and services through time, protecting them against higher prices. However, if it rises with productivity, that means that as workers are able to produce more goods and services per hour, on average, minimum wage earners will be able to buy more goods and services through time. So by tying the wage increase to productivity, you actually give these workers more buying power, which that money goes right back into the economy. But instead, they're tying it to the median wage, which has barely increased over the past 40 years. Now, here is what the wages would be today if worker pay had kept pace with productivity gains since 1968. Today's minimum wage would be $24 an hour. In such a world, a full-time minimum wage worker would be earning $48,000 a year in the United States. So by tying it to productivity, right now, people would be making an actual living wage at $24 an hour. And on top of that, you would also have real buying power. But instead, right now, it's hovering around $7, and they want to increase it to $15 over 4 years as opposed to doing it immediately. Now, there's another, yes, so the issue that's always brought up is how can small businesses possibly deal with a drastic increase immediately, because they're barely being able to pay their workers now. So the one argument that I am very sympathetic to is if you can't pay an employee a living wage, then maybe your company shouldn't exist. But putting that aside, there is a way to actually do this while helping small businesses. You can subsidize them to pay their workers a living wage. Already, the government subsidizes fossil fuel companies, subsidizes other industries. Why can't you subsidize small businesses to help pay their workers, which has been done, by the way, during the pandemic in a number of countries? So why can't you subsidize small businesses to help pay through the transition to a higher minimum wage? Help subsidize them to pay those wages until those companies can actually pay it themselves. Now, of course, I'm talking about small business. When you're talking about Walmart or any other big box retailer or fast food chain, they can afford to take the hit, lower executive pay, take the hit, and increase wages for workers. They can afford to do that themselves. But when it comes to small businesses, I'm partially sympathetic that, yes, some will need help, and they can be subsidized to do so. Now, one last thing. This really, for me, just kind of sums it up. Luke Savage here tweeting out, if even 10% of elected politicians had ever had to live on it, a minimum wage would probably be twice what it currently is. This gets to the heart of the issue, how disconnected Washington is from the average individual. The idea that there is even a fight over transitioning it or having this increase over 4 years. The idea that Republicans wouldn't even take this up for a vote 2 years ago, even though it already is an incredibly conservative compromise on increasing wages. The disconnect is really impossible to describe, but you see it in legislation like this, when even the part of this that is supposed to be more representative of workers, clearly we've seen a lot of evidence to the contrary, but the part of that is supposed to be more representative of the working class, introducing legislation that still increases the wage over the course of 4 years, where, in 4 years, you're going to need more money than $15 an hour to be able to live on. But when even that party is completely inadequate in what they are proposing here, it shows you just how disconnected Washington is from the average individual.